Welcome to the extra credits of Coralie Farjat's The Substance. I'm Trey.
And I'm Kelsi.
So this movie is wild.
Yeah.
This film is one of the most visceral and visually stunning movies of the year, and I think one of the great surprises of 2024.
Yeah.
It blends a lot of genres. We're talking body horror, psychological terror, dark comedy even, that is very absurd, into this pretty bold allegory. It's doing a lot. It's critiquing beauty standards, Hollywood's objectification of women, the male gaze. It is unapologetically repetitive in all of those ideas, and its visuals and its score. It is allegorical, like I said, so it is like highly satirical, where the characters often feel like more concepts than developed people.
Yeah.
Which is fine if you're bought into the satire, which is not going to work for everyone. So this is also a very divisive movie. But The Substance is very good to me. At the very least, it is very good.
It's one of my favorites of the year.
Yeah, it's up there. It's in my top 10, certainly. One of the reasons I like this movie a lot is because it is so knowingly elevated and it's so self-aware in its repetitive metaphors. And I really respect this director, Farjat's cinematic and storytelling vision and how straightforward she was about the absurdity of things like misogyny in media or the male gaze in media.
Yeah.
And finding the humor in how just strange and bizarre patriarchy is.
Yeah. The repetition of the shots of the jazzercising, right?
Yes.
I know that's like also we'll talk about where a lot of the criticism is like coming from in terms of the repetition here, but I think like it is really successful in knowingly using filmmaking techniques to really focus on something like the male gaze to show how boring and absurd, yet how much power it has like within the industry or like context of these characters' lives.
Right. And two people that also make this movie work are Demi Moore and Margaret Qualley.
Yeah.
And they nailed that tone perfectly. I think they understand Farjat's like bizarre, ironic through line that she's going through. And like I already said, technically, this movie is also divisive because it's one of the most over-the-top, maximalist, visual, and sonically stylized movies of the year. I think probably right next to Challengers.
I thought a lot about Challengers, and I think it's just because of the score. Yeah.
Or I Saw the TV Glow, like movies that are kind of in your face about these different experiences their characters are going through to a degree that I think will put people off, for The Substance at least. I think people will be or have already been irritated by this film. For people who like understand the satire of it all too. I'm not just talking like poor media literacy here, which is the case for a lot of movies that dive deep into satire at this kind of allegorical level. But I think there's a lot of kind of constructive criticism that is like really well realized. There's some great essays about this movie just not working, and we're going to get into all that today.
Yeah.
But I think that Farjat really infuses the themes of this film into the craft along with the performers, and they really understand the comical absurdity of everything they're trying to explore.
Yeah.
From the insert shots to the sharp edits to the booming use of its theme song.
Yeah.
And the theme song, I love the theme song of The Substance. It almost feels like a Trent Reznor, Atticus Ross like song on 0.75 speed.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah.
And the boom of it really reminds me of the Challenger score earlier this year. So if you're into everything that I'm saying, and you haven't seen this movie and you're down for like an elevated tone that the movie's aiming for and body horror, if you're okay with that, then I recommend seeing this.
Yeah. And it's not like, so I'm a huge horror fan. I mean, both of us are, but I'm personally not as much into like body horror. Even though I understand like the interesting things that those movies can do conceptually.
Sure.
But this movie in particular, I think is like almost light body horror, and that it's so tied into the like themes and the what the character is specifically going through in that moment that it doesn't actually feel maybe as drawn out, I guess, if that makes sense, because it's so fast paced. You have that synthy score driving like there's a propulsion right to the story that it feels like a little body horror light.
It's also very it's so knowing, and it's where it's indulgent about the body horror. It's very funny. Like where it's particular about the body horror, like there is a thing that Demi Moore is doing to Margaret Qualley in this movie that becomes funny. Like we saw it in a theater, so there was a live reaction for us, obviously with a huge audience. It was sold out. It was a great theater experience.
Yeah.
And there was a moment where Demi Moore is sewing, right? And it's just like the audience is laughing with how it was shot, right?
Or Margaret Qualley's sewing.
Oh, vice versa.
Yeah.
I apologize. Yeah. So there are things like that would normally be like indulgent and kind of like creepy in the way it's shot. But in this movie, again, I think maybe one of the reasons is it's with the themes in this film, but also being written and directed by a woman as well. Like it's more self-aware of how body horror has also exploited or objectified women in the past too.
It feels like it's almost talking about how like body horror is like a part of women's experience in terms of how like larger systems might treat their body. And so it feels like very much in conversation with that. And I think the director is very knowing of that.
Yeah, it's very Cronenberg-esque in as far as like knowing the media's role in people going through like a psychosis, and which is certainly a part of this movie's through line. So yeah, The Substance, go see it. It's already on streaming, I think, for Mubi, I believe.
Yeah, I think you can get a free 7-day trial or something.
Do that.
Definitely check it out.
Yeah, it's one of the best horror movies of this decade. It's up there with Nope, Barbarian, Nanny, The Watcher.
Yeah.
Those kinds of movies. It's in that conversation. And then again, obviously, like without the performances from Demi Moore and Margaret Qualley, I think they deserve to be seen in this movie at the level that they're acting, because they need to like perfectly nail the tone of this film, and they do. And so without their perfectly executed performances, especially Demi Moore, I'm not sure this movie would work, because it really relies on a film going audience to have a meta commentary with the Demi Moore of it all, and knowing how she has been treated by Hollywood and currently is still being treated by Hollywood in terms of roles being taken from her over the past 25 years that are more complex that she would have gotten in the 90s. And so if you're aware of all of that too, this is the kind of movie for you.
Yeah.
So check this out. All right. So spoiler alert. The Substance follows Demi Moore as Elizabeth Sparkle, portrayed as this kind of aging former Hollywood star who was once very relevant in an industry that is right at the top. You can tell very like objectifying and exploitative. It's a media that obviously very much represents an American media cycle, but also Hollywood. And so the media is portrayed in this movie as this institution that worships youth, and one that's starting to discard women in particular as they age.
Yeah.
And the movie doesn't really have a time or place necessarily, but it does feel like a retro futuristic.
Yeah, it does feel futuristic, and also the director likes to use like in her other film these kind of like orange, right?
Yeah,
like chairs or something in the apartment, and also that we have that huge window with the billboard. It feels like a Black Mirror episode, right? So
or really like nightmarish version of Dr. Seuss. Or something like
it feels out of time in the exaggeration, but still feels like a kind of a dystopian. I think it really works, like the setting for this to feel like it is really commenting on obviously like what is happening in the industry, but to make it so heightened that it feels like it can, like people can buy into it as this alternate reality that then is like a larger reflection as we get deeper and deeper into it. Yeah,
which I think is smart. And again, Demi Moore, the star of this movie, really knows the kind of film she's in. I think she gives, you can tell right away, like a career best performance, or like in that conversation for a career best performance.
Yeah.
And she fully embodies this character, Elizabeth Sparkle's desperation and even addiction is hinted at, and kind of self-loathing in a role that could easily be read as problematic because of all those things that I'm talking about. And those are loaded terms about women in this industry in particular that are like need historical context for you to understand them. And this movie does a really good job to show that she is physically and emotionally and psychologically vulnerable because of the way that the media has been taking advantage of her throughout her life.
Exactly. Yeah, I think there are like two ways you can read this film. Should we like talk about it as we get into spoilers later, or should we do it now?
We can do it now, or we can talk more about the actors first. It's up to you.
Okay. Well, I guess we could do the actors, because then we're going to go into like what actually thematically is happening. But I think it's a good point, at least, and we'll continue to talk about it. But to understand that the Elizabeth Sparkle character, it's not like a character study of her, right? And
that's
what she is like psychologically like enduring. She is very much like other really successful horror movies that are kind of more allegorical, and people return to are kind of, again, just these like specific devices to look at, or specifically, I mean, it's very direct to like talk about beauty standards and the constructs like and constraints in Hollywood or in this industry. So I think that's like definitely an important distinction going into it and why I love it so much. And we'll talk more about like, I think how I'm seeing different people reading it and how I understand how they're reading it differently. But yeah.
Yeah, well, I mean, that speaks to like Demi Moore's journey that I was just hinting at before the spoiler talk, which is that Demi Moore, through her like 20s and early to mid 30s, her persona was shaped by an industry that obviously saw her as an object. It portrayed her as an object in movies. The audience, of the substance, hopefully is conscious of that. It adds to the experience if you have that meta commentary.
Yeah.
And so Demi Moore, one of my favorite actors from that era, in movies like G.I. Jane, tries to reclaim her sexual image from the industry, but still is objectified in those kinds of movies.
Right.
And so she's had a very similar, what looks to be like career arc as an Elizabeth Sparkle character. So I would assume, we're maybe going to be able to have Forjot on the podcast very soon, which is really exciting.
Yeah.
I assume when I talk to her that I'm going to ask her that she had Demi Moore in mind when writing this script in particular.
Because Demi Moore is the perfect cast.
Really is.
Again, like that meta conversation that's going on beyond the movie.
But the sad part, as well as like, film going fans know, if you're kind of like a cinephile, you're probably aware there are many women with a trajectory of Elizabeth Sparkle that you could cast in this role, but Demi Moore in particular, in terms of how she was sexualized or hypersexualized by the industry, is perfect for this kind of role. And so I hope she does get to kind of win an award for this movie, or an Oscar maybe, even though I think that's reaching, just because the Oscars have a prejudice against horror films and like really look down on them, like lowbrow genre films.
Yeah.
But if she does, the irony of that is like,
the industry is giving her an award for
exactly
like what the movie
so it'd be a great middle finger
did to her.
To Hollywood. Yeah, I'm sure she'd have a great speech.
Yeah.
And that's really what this performance is. It's like, that's what I'm saying. I don't see with her character, and we'll get into more of the specifics that Kelsi was about to jump into, but the kind of like the leaning into the problematic tragedy of this character being self-loathing. I see that less. I see the character more as being used in this concept study of having this massive manifesto at the end of the film, where there's like a declaration of a middle finger to Hollywood, right? And the media as a whole. And so Demi Moore, a masterclass in horror comedy acting.
Yeah.
In particular horror comedy, because I thought a lot about Jordan Peele's Us, in that layered performance that Lupita Nyong'o gives is like two different characters in that film. And that movie being very elevated. Yeah. And you do have to suspend like plot logic beats, which is going to irritate a lot of people. It did for Us, and I'm sure it's going to do that for The Substance as well. But Nyong'o really excellently portrays that tone of between comedy and horror. Yeah. And Demi Moore does that here too.
I think that's a great example. I mean, I think like with other movies, we understand that like with Us in particular, there was a lot of criticism around like not understanding the logic of the world, or that not being fully explained. And maybe that's also something here with like the actual substance, right? Like, does it make sense? Are they the same person? Like those kind of questions. But ultimately, like, we fall on the side of like, it doesn't really matter. I'm more interested in what the director has to say.
Yeah.
And that is like very direct here. And so maybe the only piece we'll get to is at the end, where I have some questions.
Me too.
Yeah.
Yeah. The last 15, 20 minutes.
Yeah.
Opposite Moore, let's talk about Margaret Qualley as Sue, Elizabeth's younger, artificially created doppelganger, who literally emerges from Elizabeth's body in a wild sequence.
Great. Yeah.
One of the most convincing body horror sequences in recent memory, I think. And Qualley's performance is intentionally hyper stylized as she kind of embodies the beauty standards imposed by this media or Hollywood system that we're watching in the movie, almost to the point where it looks like the movie's having fun by digitally compositing over her body. Right. That hasn't been confirmed or anything like that, but it does feel like that in moments.
Yeah.
Because the filmmaking is in conversation with the themes and the narrative. And so you see these like tightly choreographed movements where the camera is literally playing the male gaze, or is in a male gazing POV. And you see the camera's POV kind of objectifying her in these surreal music video like sequences. Definitely.
Yeah. I think the specific like jazzercise element, I like that they actually did make it this, it feels like out of time, but something from the past where we see a really popular workout show, right? and someone who is the star of this. But I like that it's kind of contained in this one soundstage.
Yeah.
Where it is like we see the male gaze become almost like a character in itself or a concept in itself
That's
is
a
like
good way to put it.
knowingly a piece of the movie. And I think the repetition is really important to do that. I just have to go back to the sequence where Sue emerges from Moore's body, which I love the sequence where we like start with the egg, like the substance gets put into the egg and it becomes
injection.
two, or the like a clone figure essentially.
Or is it a clone?
Or is it, well, yeah.
We'll talk about
it. But also I love when Demi Moore's like eye doubles and then like moves across her body. It's just, it's great.
Those small visuals are really memorable.
And if you like, I was rewatching some of it this morning. I didn't get to finish it. I really want to watch it again. But I also like how it does feel practical. Right? Like there are moments that they don't feel real, but they feel really effective in that body horror lane.
You also don't want to be too practical. You want to stay in this elevated space that we're in the movie that does feel a little bit surreal.
Yeah.
So that is a kind of an issue in the design of the movie, but it's not a criticism because they nail that line so well.
Yeah.
Or they toe it so well.
Yeah. But you're right. It does look like, especially when we get to the male gaze sequences, like there's a kind of like tabloid magazine airbrushification, right? Like of those sequences that you can definitely feel.
So going back to the male gaze as a character, let's get more into the satire of this film, because this film is attempting to portray things like the male gaze while also critiquing it. So it feels like at times that it's platforming something that's problematic, that it's also trying to criticize and really indict and possibly indict the audience's gaze as well, as far as like the movie going audience, not just the audience that you see in this movie at the end.
Right.
So as far as the satire, I want to like have an aside for this conversation because and like pause the plot for a second, because this is a pretty divisive film. Like we said at the top, it's a pretty like reactionary conversation online, understandably, because this is a very sensitive subject, especially how it handles women's agency and how it uses the male gaze in subversive ways, like we're saying. Some think it's contradicting its own message. Some believe it's like purposely platforming misogyny or sexist visuals or that gaze, because it's attempting to expose and critique those very things.
Yeah.
I think we're more in the latter. That's not to say that you can still know that the latter is happening while still having an issue with it. I do think that is like more of the criticism that I'm seeing that is like really well intended. I think that this movie is divisive ultimately because it is so maximalist and repetitive.
Sure.
I think it is like really indulging in what it's trying to criticize. It really reminds me of The Wolf of Wall Street. And as far as the discourse around the film, and maybe some of the issues that The Wolf of Wall Street had too, where it indulges so much in the finance bro, the exploitation of women's bodies, the homophobia, and maybe lingering in that humor or objectification too long,
right?
And then not getting its critique across enough. And plus, Scorsese is like this humanist filmmaker who always is trying to like humanize all of these like terrible people, and then ultimately pull the rug out from under us at the end and let us know that we've been laughing at jokes instead of being in on the joke, which is the satire of a lot of his films. And so I think The Substance is having an interestingly similar reaction, where people are pretty divided but on the same page. Like they know that it's a satire, they know what it's trying to do, they may even think the themes are admirable, but ultimately it's like an irritating film that is platforming the very things it's trying to expose or criticize, and ultimately doesn't do those things well enough.
Sure, I get that. And and I think The Wolf of Wall Street is like a really good example, because when we talked about that movie on the Patreon, when we I guess a couple months ago, right?
Feels recent, but I actually think it was one of the first we did on the show.
So almost like a year.
A year or so ago.
Okay, so but that was one of the things that we talked about, definitely, right? Like the read at the time, and then also like how people understand it as a satire now. But with The Wolf of Wall Street, I think even watching it now, that's like one of my maybe critiques is like lingering in the character's point of view, maybe for too long, like you're saying, with like especially really charismatic actors that people really loved at that time, like a Jonah Hill, like a Leo, like a John Bernthal, and then maybe not making it as clear what he was essentially doing with those characters, right?
And maybe leaning into what you're trying to be critical of, and the problems that can occur then, especially in the reaction, because how we know that film fans had to like reclaim The Wolf of Wall Street from the very people who were being criticized, the archetypes of our culture that were being criticized.
There was a lot of like explaining that had to go on,
right. And so I think because the substance kind of forces audiences to confront their own lens or interpretations, the movie does risk alienating viewers, especially because, again, it is maximalist, it is repetitive, it is indulgent in the very tropes it's seeking to critique. So it is a really bold allegory. It's a really bold story about patriarchy, about all the things that I've been saying. It actually has very similar themes to the $1 billion Barbie movie. You know what I mean? Like it has similar ideas, except Barbie is a very commercial movie, right? It's a very mainstream film, so it has to simplify a lot of issues that it's exploring. The substance gets to be a little bit more provocative.
It makes like essentially, if we're comparing it to like a Barbie type of movie, the Ken character like gross with his power, not
the Dennis Quaid
playing
figure in this
movie, as like a humorous, like obsessed with horses or whatever. Ryan Gosling's character,
it's horsepower.
But I think like in this movie too, like Barbie's a great example, just as a recent movie, right, to compare it to, in that it's focused on like a Margot Robbie character development while being in like a Barbie movie, right? But
that's a good point, though. It is like a character journey.
But it is, looking at her, like her basically dealing with all these obstacles. And I think that might also be where I'm seeing a divide with the substance kind of takeaways. Like, I think some people are seeing it as a kind of character study, sort of, in Demi Moore's like world, and then how she's dealing with this Sue clone, her own like self-loathing, a psychological journey of her going through being discarded by this industry. I don't view it that way. Like, I don't view the moment, which is one of the, I think, all-time scenes in this movie. I don't view her like taking off her makeup or like messing it up in the mirror, or keeping like applying makeup before she goes to her date as the kind of like main example of the theme of the movie. Like, I don't, I view that just as an example of like something that she is going through because of the constraints of the industry, and like dealing with and grappling with the idea of what she has been, like what the industry assigns value or says like is valuable about her, which is like her beauty, and especially, again, this is like specifically within like it's looking at beauty standards as like a construct, so it's like also looking at like this white woman, like of Demi Moore, right, this very narrow like beauty standard. So but people can see it in that one way of like, okay, this is like a character psychological journey body horror, and the body horror represents then kind of that element of like self-loathing,
and that's where the problematic things pop up because of the individuality.
And then if you read it that way, I can definitely see like the repetition of the male gaze being something that it does not work. But I don't really read it that way. I read it, again, more like how we're talking about in the like allegorical, very direct movie, like horror, right, movie that we see of like Peel's Us or like Stepford Wives, right? Where the characters,
concept
again,
study satire,
are like more representing in the second view, or like how I read it, this idea that the characters are like going through this industry that has power over like their jobs, how they're valued. They're also like a representation of how they're valued in society, like Demi Moore and Sue. And then also like the constraints that they have to navigate through that. And ultimately like the audience and the norms that the audience like are upholding by maybe going to see this like show. And then also the executives, like more specifically, have in this industry. And so I that's like more so how I read it, is like, this is just like a allegorical horror text.
Right.
And so I don't think the repetition for me then becomes anything that's like problematic. If anything, it's just like, again, really being clear about what she's trying to get at.
Yes. And I think the indulging in what you're attempting to critique is the point of these maximalist satires. So if that still doesn't land for you, I totally understand, because
Yeah.
ultimately, like, if people are thinking this movie doesn't do a good enough job being a concept study, it does lean too much into the emotional journey of Elizabeth's character and her relationship to Sue as something that is she, like, it was a person she's separating herself from or disconnecting from throughout the course of this movie. Then I understand if you feel like the film isn't balancing those two worlds well enough, because the way we read it is just the latter, the concept study, and not everybody will see it that way, which I understand why. I think
And there
the reason,
is a question at the end of the movie
that's what I was just about to get to. Yeah, which is like the last 15 or 20 minutes of this movie, almost like the last act of Wolf of Wall Street, I do think complicates the film, because it almost, the movie outstays its welcome and what it's trying to explore.
Yeah.
And I think the shock value of the end of this film that we can get to in a second, after we talk, we're skipping over a large part of the plot.
Yeah.
But the shock value of the end of this film, I think, does.
Yeah, we didn't touch on the, like, Demi Moore and Margaret Qualley, or is it Qualley?
Qualley,
right?
I think.
Fight, right? in the apartment when they're both, like, conscious. Yeah.
But what I was saying was, I do think the end of this movie's shock value overwhelming the narrative's ideas or concept study or allegory or satire of it all, I think is totally fair. And I think that might be what's happening more so, which is the shock value is so repetitive, so indulgent, giving us like sexual, intentionally sexual visuals or images.
Yeah, like the objectification,
and sexist images, rather. And that aspect of the movie can definitely confuse the rest of the film for a lot of people. So I do feel like this movie does outstay its welcome a little bit. And The Wolf of Wall Street is a very similar issue, but it does the opposite. Instead of like the hyper maximalism, Wolf of Wall Street, there is a I don't know,
it's almost like a grounding, of
the Jordan Belfort character that feels like a sympathetic reading of the figure at the end of that movie. Then
I don't actually think it is, but I can definitely see how people would read it.
And a movie can be a 5-star film and still be flawed, and Wolf of Wall Street is one of those. And I do think the substance will live in a similar place 5 to 10 years from now. But let's talk about the rest of the movie. So we're about to get to the final act, but the narrative's major conceit, which I don't even know if we've brought up yet, but resolves around the substance, right? The science fiction conceit serum run by this anonymous male figure on a phone that offers Elizabeth a younger, physically perfect, quote unquote, version of herself, Sue, who's the Margaret Qualley character. And the catch is, even though Elizabeth and Sue are told they share a consciousness and are one and the same, you are one, they must switch bodies every 7 days. But for Elizabeth to sustain Sue, she has to extract her own spinal fluid, which gets very complicated throughout the film as Elizabeth starts aging very quickly and rapidly, and her body starts breaking down. And that extraction becomes a grotesque kind of like motif of the movie that I think amplifies the film's themes of addiction and self-harm, but again, more importantly, as a product of the media commodifying women's bodies, and not of the individual, which is where I think a lot of that also criticism can get confused. And throughout the narrative, you start noticing that Elizabeth and Sue start to disassociate, like what I was saying a second ago, where there's a moment where it first hit me when watching this. There's a billboard of Sue outside Elizabeth's window. And that's kind of this meta moment where they're divided by this window frame with this image of what Elizabeth should feel like she's looking at herself. But instead feels like she's looking at someone else. And so that fracture dynamic gets worse throughout the film. But that was the moment where I think people have locked onto that moment and have looked at this movie as having some plot holes, because there's this like split consciousness going on between Elizabeth and Sue. And much like Jordan Peele's Us, because there's such elevated allegories, I don't really, like, I suspend my narrative logic, not to the point where a movie just like deserves like this very kind of literature like reading only. Like, I still need to have these like beats that I understand logics of a concept or a character.
Like logic enough to the movie in terms of like what it's trying to say. That's all that really matters to me.
But what I wanted to think about for a second, maybe listeners, let us know what you think about this in the comments. I haven't really seen a lot of people write about this, but it was my takeaway from the movie, and I walked away with this reading, and I never saw it again in film criticism of the film. But I was never sure we were supposed to believe the rules and the science of the man on the phone. And so, like, when he tells her, "You're one," like, I didn't believe him, because, like, what man in this movie are you supposed to believe? And so, like, whether he represents pharmaceuticals or media or just, like, the patriarchy at large, I was just thinking that the split consciousness in the literal story was because they literally were two different people.
Interesting.
And so that's why they were always confused when they woke up from one
Yeah.
another, wondering what they were doing in their days that they had, to live the 7 days of the week, or how Elizabeth kind of or Sue kind of extended that and lived on for multiple weeks.
I mean, I guess you could look at it as like they're sleeping, that like side of their consciousness, but it did feel like there were two different people.
Well, then the allegory works too, not just the literal narrative, because the metaphor for like Hollywood's exploitation of women, kind of reducing them to like these interchangeable parts where women are being like discarded, and that creates this like psychosis. Like, that's an interesting idea, part of the allegory. But I think literally, like, I can suspend logic narrative holes, I guess, because I do believe it feels like I'm watching almost two different people. So I mean, listeners, let us know what you think in the comments. Yeah,
I mean, I have seen people read it as like this idea of, which I can understand. Like, then I would not really love the movie, of this women being like called like crazy or like, self-obsessed, like those kind of things, because of stuff. Because of like the pressures like on them. But I don't really think that it actually explores Demi Moore's anger, I think, more so than like that specific like psychological self-hatred or something.
Sure.
Like, and to me, I think the anger then aligns more so with like how I'm looking at her as a piece of how Hollywood like treats her.
Exactly.
And like, especially because it starts with like the star, right? It starts with like a symbol. And she is just like a symbol in the movie to me.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, again, like, we're coming back to this along like kind of the entire podcast, but we really are not reading the narrative too literally.
Yeah.
But I was trying to find some like, maybe there weren't holes in it literally. Maybe you just don't trust the guy on the phone who tells you that he's got all the answers and the substance creates the same person. So along the way, we meet Dennis Quaid's character, right? And he becomes the key antagonist of the film. His character's name obviously is not a coincidence, being Harvey. And he is this cartoonish antagonist, this kind of embodiment of misogyny with power.
Right, which she like returns to this like visual grotesque eating sequence of the shrimp, right, which she does in her other movie with eating as well.
Right, and I think he's really well cast and does a good job in terms of what's asked of him, though I don't know if Dennis Quaid is totally aware of the role he's playing, or the character, or the subversions of that character. Given his life. And so I think the character, though, regardless, really underscores the kind of like pervasive and systemic nature of like this top-down exploitation.
Yeah.
So I think that was really smart, especially all the kind of nameless men who were in the boardroom, like that moment where
they all look like kind of like clones, like Barbie, kind of. Yeah.
Very similar
in the
to Barbie.
boardroom.
Yeah, with the Will Ferrell character. And then we get to the final 30 minutes of this movie, which is what we've been talking around for the entire podcast. But this is the act where there is a lot of like hyper sexualized imagery,
right?
Where there's this exaggerated objectification going on, and then
this is like the New Year's Eve part,
the New Year's Eve part
broadcast,
the
or whatever.
Fight between Sue and Elizabeth, leading to the multiple injections, leading to the John Carpenter's The Thing version of both of them as this mutation, leading to the New Year's Eve party,
right?
And the chaos that ensues there that turns into this Brian De Palma's Carrie,
right?
Exactly,
event. Yeah.
And I love the idea of this final 30 minutes on paper. It's very confrontational, not just to the audience of the movie, but to the audience in the theater.
Yeah.
And the idea of this mutation kind of having all these blood and guts pour out of them onto the audience is very meta, I think, in a really fun way that is smart and subversive for Jot to get in her second feature film, I believe.
Yeah.
So it's pretty wild that she was able to get this in greenlit. So there's no fault to the director or the writing of making this choice in the movie, because it is like quite the ambitious choice that I'm sure many women filmmakers who've wanted to play in this world have not been able to make for the history of cinema. And so like it's a pretty massive moment in filmmaking history to get this kind of moment, and also reclaiming Carrie in an interesting way from Brian De Palma, because there are some, even though a very good movie, some interesting kind of feminist readings of that film having its own issues that are pretty unexamined. And so I think it's a really big final 30 minutes, like I said at the top, very maximalist, very loud. That I do think maybe again suffers from the shock value overpowering the narrative.
Well, I think just how like I enjoyed the repetitive and kind of like length of the jazzercise sequences to like show again, like to show like what the Sue character is going through, just as like another cycle of the Elizabeth Sparkles character being objectified. But I think that this sequence actually like did similar things, but then like overstayed its welcome to me. Like it went on for a little too long, in that it kind of complicated the message that may have been a good lasting, like kind of direct message to the audience, where I felt like the first half of the film, or first, like, I guess like 2/3 of the film, really like
first
nailed that.
Half, really,
but here it got confused. But I still think that it works. It's just that when we get to the actual like monstrous figure, we have like the monstrous feminine like archetype in horror, right? But I think that like the director is knowingly using this idea of seeing like women as monstrous figures in the horror genre, and then kind of like reclaiming that in a way, especially since the audience is in this like really weird New Year's Eve, like,
very strange.
Women are topless. Like, I think it's like also talking about the normalization of like sexualizing women on like just like cable television. Like, and then, Sue comes out, and we're supposed to understand the audience is like in the theater is supposed to be the audience in the auditorium,
which is really cool.
Yeah. And then the executives specifically are like all matching, like sitting in this auditorium. It's like such a strange, like, why are they in an auditorium? But and then we have kind of like the Carrie sequence, right? Of like, instead of all her classmates, it's the executives and the audience trapped in this room, and the blood and guts that's like spewed all over them is supposed to be indicting them, is supposed to be kind of saying like, oh, well, didn't you like me? Right. I think she says at one point, like, it's just me. Like, so you don't like me in this like specific,
exactly.
If I'm not meeting this like very specific beauty construct. The only issue here is that while I think that it's successful in kind of using, right, being aware of the monstrous feminine, it also does get complicated, where I was thinking like, well, in this, beauty construct, thematic exploration in this specific movie, like, we are also going into this idea of like something being like ugly or grotesque, and that, I don't know, there was parts of it that felt like maybe
well
not totally
then
like thought out at the end there, especially because once we get to the very end with Elizabeth Sparkle, right, when like the monstrous figure like comes outside, Elizabeth Sparkle in like Flubber version, right?
Flubber,
is like crawling,
yeah,
right, and clawing her way to her star on Hollywood Boulevard, and we end with like her face right on the star.
That's fascinating,
and so that's why I totally understand if people are reading it as like Elizabeth Sparkle is clinging to fame,
indictment on the individual versus indictment on the institutions.
Or like this was an exploration of Elizabeth Sparkle like trying to like deal with but I think that like actually confuses what I genuinely think like the movie was trying to get at, which was the industry, which was beauty constructs, which were these constraints over time. And then that just, I think, confused it a little bit at the end. I think it should have just ended at the kind of New Year's Eve broadcast of the Carrie sequence, because then you have that indictment that like really it was a big shock like in our theater.
It's also a twist on a fairy tale. It's a twist on an American dream. It's a twist on that kind of fantasy. And so I think that starting with the star and ending with the star is like just a good bookend. Like it just is probably on paper, but maybe in terms of like the cinematic execution, because it outstayed its welcome in that sequence.
Well, it also focused on Elizabeth Sparkle in that moment.
Yes.
Too.
But I think what we're saying about the Wolf of Wall Street stuff is going to kind of be in the favor of this movie, which I do think people are going to look at it like way more as a in-your-face satire. And I think that they won't treat it as much of an individual indictment in 10 to 15 years. So I saw some of those takes in critique, essays online. I also saw people talked about how there was imagery that divided people. Like there was a moment where one of Sue Elizabeth's mutation on stage, like one of their breasts falls off, and the camera, again, in the male gazy way, like kind of shoots to the breast on the ground.
Right.
And in the way it does that, in the process of that, it looks like it is doing the monstrous feminine thing, where it is playing into like this, really just kind of like this exploitative look at women's bodies and as they age and how Hollywood doesn't want them anymore and they're not beautiful anymore, quote unquote beautiful. Like this is like what the movie is speaking to rather than critiquing. Yeah. And obviously I think we do think it is criticizing.
I think it's like very knowingly like looking at in this like second half of the specific like figure that's seen as monstrous to the executives, to the audience, and then still like keeping within the message of like literally objectifying women to the point where like they're body is like an object on the floor, just
exactly.
as if Margaret Qualley's like body was a different objects that were being shown in like different pieces, right? Yeah.
It becomes a metaphor for dehumanizing women too, and most importantly.
I just thought it was like making it uber clear.
Well, I think the whole idea with the end of the movie, which is this large spectacle, is that it's not a spectacle of killing everybody in the audience. It's not a spectacle of this, quote unquote disgusting creature that they turned into. It's less of that. It's playing into the audience's exploitation of those things. And so it's very subversive and meta in that way. And it's more of a spectacle of rejection. It's a spectacle of rejecting that level of exploitation on all those different fronts. And I think it's more of an indictment, like how we've been saying, on the audience watching the movie, importantly. So I think it was still an effective ending that consistently carried through the through line throughout the rest of the movie. But ultimately, again, I think because the shock value was maybe looked at as more important than the narrative at the end, it came off very shallow to people, which I understand. The finale is divisive. It's complicated.
It worked. It like ultimately the movie as a whole worked for me, but I can understand. Yeah,
it's also deeply cynical, right? Because like neither Elizabeth nor Sue are really granted much meaningful agency because it is a satire that is like an elevated allegory, so it's not a character study. And so if you are in this is like a Nora kind of energy of like watching The Substance, then you're going to think, where's the agency for these characters? Which I totally understand that too, but that's just not. That wasn't the tone of movie that we were in,
for
us. And so like I never had a moment where I was thinking that the lack of agency meant that this movie was
because it wasn't a character study. Like
ultimately that was the way that was my language or conversation with the movie as I was watching
I was just looking at like what is the purpose of the filmmaker, and then do those choices make sense for that specific goal? They did in this movie for me,
right? So ultimately, I think when I left the movie, I was genuinely conflicted because I'm like, this is clearly concept over satire, but does that give an excuse to not do some things well enough? But I think I lean toward this movie at the very least being an excellent cinematic accomplishment of a vision, narratively and technically, like in its performances. Like everybody seems to be on the same page in making this movie, which is a huge compliment to Farjat and the future of her work, because I do think we're watching somebody become like their own auteur, like in the moment, not just of this genre, because we saw Revenge and like she clearly has a vision. That movie I think is a lot less successful in what it's trying to do, but it's still there is a color palette, there is a similar elevated tone,
specific like technical aspects that she brings to her work,
right? So she's very unique, feels like a singular vision, which is always a really cool moment to be in the zeitgeist of a movie doing well like this, when you're having a new artist get this kind of like really capital in an industry that has not afforded women these kind of opportunities.
And also I feel like, we see like maximalism usually in like action films, or it's coded as like a masculine like filmmaking like archetype.
That's true.
Or not, but you know what I mean? Like technique. And I feel like here, like it really like just puts an exclamation point on everything in this movie. It and also like has a knowing humor. Like I think it just really works with the specific like subversive story that she's telling within this horror like body horror genre, that I think it's like really interesting to see what she'll do next, because it's something that lends itself to really like making a very straightforward but enjoyable like experience, where you can tell something that is pretty simple, like looking at beauty standards in the Hollywood industry, but also looking at how those like manifest more at large. But I think like I'm just interested to see what she'll do next.
I'm so curious. And again, hopefully we can get her on in the next week or so, because I would love to ask her about the conversation around this film and also the future of what she wants to explore. So let's get to our extra credits.
Yeah.
So I'll go first. Demi Moore.
Okay,
and I know that's like a basic extra credit, because usually, again, we do this. We just talked about We Live in Time, and we gave extra credit to the actors on that film too.
Yeah.
And there's so much that I want to credit to this movie in terms of the technical execution of it and Farjat's direction. But I really don't think this movie works in its meta, direction that it wants to go into when it's speaking to the audience and trying to indict the audience without Demi Moore, like without her, like kind of playing into this very vulnerable
having the
character
meta piece of it is really important.
And so like I grew up watching her. She was like one of my favorite stars when I was a kid, and like obviously I watched her out of a different era, so I wasn't around when she was dropping movies, and so I wasn't around for that conversation, but I had very young parents, and so I was like I knew about the tabloid culture. I knew how she was presented in the media. I knew about her, like her relationships and kind of what directors would say about her and all those things. And it's fascinating to see her be able to reclaim her identity back, her image back in a movie like this. So I want to give her extra credit for just taking on the role. I've already said all the great things like about her performance in this movie, and she's excellent and very funny, and somehow still gets across that she's Demi Moore when she's in prosthetics at the end, as kind of like the older version of Elizabeth, if you will. But I just want to give extra credit to her taking on the opportunity to do this, because it could have went really poorly.
Yeah, you really have to trust the vision, right? Because it's like all, again, like this almost comment on her career trajectory.
Fame. And really it's a comment on like how basically the 21st century Hollywood studio system has like not given her opportunities. It's also a comment on just like how women have just been discarded going into their 30s throughout the history of movie making. And even though we're in a more progressive era where women, like the director and writer of this film, are getting opportunities that they wouldn't have gotten 35, 40 years ago, we're still in a space where women are hitting an age, and Hollywood is constantly looking for ways to replace them where men do not have to worry about that as much. And so like that's certainly something that Demi Moore is in conversation with in this film. And so I'm just like really, really, satisfied with the performance, but like really happy with the choice that she did to take it on. Yeah. That she had to take it on. So what about you?
I had to pull up my extra credit for the names. But I wanted to give extra credit to the practical effects because, again, I'm a huge horror fan, not as much body horror, even though I like respect it. But I just really thought the practical effects were fun in this movie, and also, again, like fit so well thematically. So Pierre Olivier Pearson was the makeup effects designer, and then Stephanie Goulion was the makeup artist. And I just want to like give them credit for really bringing these body horror elements to life that sometimes don't work for me. And I think it had a lot to do also like with the score, which I guess maybe I should just give the score extra credit as well, like keeping that fast-paced kind of like element to this movie, even though it was repetitive. I think it just really worked for me, especially in the first like 2/3 of this movie.
Yeah, I mean the score, the artist name is Rafferty, I believe.
Okay,
sorry if I'm not pronouncing that correctly. He's a British artist. But there's also an actor I wanted to shout out who plays the neighbor, who gives a lot of levity to the movie. Oh yeah, who's really good in this film. I can't find his name anywhere, but shout out that actor. But yeah, I think the makeup crew is just wild on this film. So they might even, again, if this movie gets any Oscar nominations, that would be pretty groundbreaking in horror. Obviously, Get Out was really the last.
We had like screenplay for Get Out, but
Jordan Peele,
I mean, I could see maybe like there is a lot of like buzz around this movie.
We're not really awards people, so like I don't really care, but it does get more eyes on this movie, and it did make $60 million. But for people to watch it at home, which they might around this holiday season, which would be a wild thing to do, introduce your parents or whatever, your family members or loved ones to the substance. But it is an unforgettable movie, and so that's certainly a way to pitch it. Okay, listeners, let us know what you think about The Substance in the comments. If you enjoy this conversation about a really complex film, let us know. And if you want to help support the show, you can like and subscribe. We're covering all of the best releases of 2024 right now, and we'll have a review or two, I think, a week on the YouTube feed and on our podcast on the main feed, wherever you get your podcast. All right, guys, see ya.
Bye.